Andrew, thanks for joining me. Let's start a little bit about you, first of all. Tell me a bit about your background and how you got into sort of Rosatom and nuclear energy.
Okay, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting us, to have that discussion. If you talk about myself, I'm engineer, according to my background, but not nuclear engineer, but medical engineer.
Okay.
And when I started studying, mathematics, physics, and so on, I decided, to turn a little bit towards the human being. That's why I choose as a minor medical engineering. And then, after some background in the different medical companies, I was attracted by nuclear energy. Nuclear company, which at that time wasn't Rosatom, but it was a Ministry of Nuclear Energy, agency, I would say even. And why I was attracted? Because at that time, that was one of the rare industry in the post-Soviet time, very well developed and technologically, and very prominent.
But if you're already in sort of engineering for biomedical science,
Yeah.
Why switch to nuclear when you said, oh, I wanted to do something for human beings? It seems like one is against the other.
I wouldn't say one is against the other, because, if you take sun, which is the source of our life at a certain extent, you have a fusion reaction process. So basically we live all as human beings, due to some nuclear reactions, which, happens on the sun. And fundamentally the purpose and the processes we have in the world attracted myself, very strongly. And especially one of the side I was hesitating, nuclear or medical. Finally I decided medical, but finally I decided to work in the nuclear field as, for my country, I understood nuclear is very important sector, which can create a lot of jobs and can create world leadership for my country. So it's also a question of patriotism at a certain extent.
I understand. Let's talk back then, just before we talk about what Rosatom was. When you joined, it's still the Soviet era, it's still a government, and you're going through that transition.
It was a Soviet area, but it wasn't a transitional area, as you just said,
Yeah.
from ministry
Yeah.
to the state-owned corporation.
What was it like working in that change? When you change from being government-run, we've had that in a much different way in the UK with the nationalisation of energy 25 years ago. But if you have a very strict government-run system, and then you have the opening up of the borders, you have perestroika of glasnost, and this change of Russia became much more in the early 90s, more economically driven. What was it like working in a company that started off as government and then became Rosatom?
It was extremely exciting. I can tell you that that's the most radical changes I've been through. Because you arrive to the former ministry, agency at that time, with a certain culture from the Soviet time, with a huge scientific business, not business at the time, scientific knowledge. And the goal was to convert that, at a certain extent, old school ministry into world well-known company, leader of the industry. And all of that happened during a very short period of time, 10 years. So all these discussions about the strategy, about the changes internal, external, about products, and so on, and it was a revolution for us. And
was it difficult to change that culture? Because scientists are scientists, and then they suddenly have to become not business people, but commercially minded.
Not at all. They never been commercially minded, but at that time, our mission was to convert, from kind of scientific approach where you can count a lot of money, but you count, the most important is the result, to become profitable, to become efficient, to become oriented to the values which exist in the world, and to create a world leader. That was the goal, and hopefully, during that period of time, we managed to achieve it.
Tell me about Rosatom today. What is Rosatom? Because a lot of our audience may have heard the name, but don't know what the company is. Is it purely just a nuclear generating company? Talk me through the structure.
It's a very well-organized and structured nuclear company. But it's not only that, because the current vision of Rosatom, and even if you take the Rosatom current slogan, which is energy and more, we understand that nuclear, it's one element of the sustainable development. And if you talk about decarbonization goals, about COP21 and things related with the climate change, we have to understand that nuclear is essential, but nuclear has to work with other energy generation types, as wind, as solar, as others. As well, nuclear is responsible for the energy storage to a certain extent. So it's a more energy company working in carbon-free energy generation. But on the second hand, as I told you, why I quite happy not to work on the Rosatom, because finally I combine two passions, medical and nuclear. And the technology which exists in Rosatom as a nuclear industry, they finally spun off into different other industry, and they created a lot of other industries in Russia. And
such as?
Such, if you talk about medical isotopes, they came from nuclear industry, and currently a lot of lives, human lives, have been saved due to the science and due to the isotope production, which was created within the nuclear industries, not only in Russia, but in other countries as well.
So you talk about the nuclear being the route to other things, the medical
yes, exactly,
science. Yes. Is Rosatom looking at nuclear energy now then as not just a generating solution, but kind of a wider part of kind of human development, human life?
Absolutely. I guess Rosatom looks at that as it's a core business, right? But it's a source of other businesses, which we would like to be diversified. And to be very specific, in Russia there are some programs in order to develop, supported by the government, by the way, to develop wind generation. And we participate in one of this program. We currently we won 2 tenders to build a huge wind generation park on the south of Russia. It's almost it's 600 megawatt plus 300 megawatt, so it has to be built by Rosatom. And we understand that the future is a mix. It's a balance of renewables and nuclear. So that's our vision. That's things we are believing, and we are working on that.
The view, I suppose, in the UK and in wider Europe is that Russia is principally a gas country. We get a lot of gas from you. The whole of Europe supplied from gas. If you looked at the mix, what percentage would you say of your generation is nuclear, and what percentage is renewable? Because we get the impression it's like 90% gas and that's it.
No, it's not. It's not 90%. But you're right. Russia is a very rich country in terms of gas, and nuclear currently accounts for 17% of internal generation.
17%. So
17%.
Almost a fifth.
Yeah.
That's quite significant.
So it's quite significant, and more of that. Imagine if we are not competitive and we are compete with gas within Russia, which is a very tough market, and we have 17% share, so we stay competitive against gas internally. I'm not talking about because there is a certain difference between internal price for gas and external price. And we'd like to increase our share up to 25%. And in certain regions, we don't have just enough infrastructure to build nuclear power stations because, in Far East and on the north, we don't have a lot of areas with developed infrastructure which require nuclear power station. So we have to keep using gas there. And gas probably will be decreasing. And nuclear, we believe, will be increasing. That's what will happen in our country. Wow. And if you talk other countries, not necessarily other countries that are so rich in gas, what they have to do. And nuclear, it's a route to energy independence. Like in France, it's an energy independent country. 75% is nuclear. And I guess it's a good option for the countries which don't have natural resources.
Let's talk about a couple of the things. For obviously, everyone will remember Chernobyl. Now, Chernobyl was in Kiev, but it was part of the greater Soviet Union at that time. Have the Russian public, what's their attitude towards nuclear? Are they convinced it's safe? Do they still get haunted by the issues of Chernobyl?
It's obviously, you have to separate two things. Chernobyl, it's a big tragedy for us, and we always remember that. And it's a pain for us. We live with that, and we do all our best in order to avoid that in happening in the future. And on the second hand, Russian people, and myself as well, I represent Russian people, we believe that with a new development, it's a safe energy. And we work very important thing is transparency. And when our former leader, Sergei Kiriyenko, arrived, he decided, it was a part of the transition we talked at the very beginning, that we have to become very transparent in order to communicate to our population, to our people, and
to get the public trust.
To get to the public trust, because without public trust, you cannot build anything. Because the most important to build the public trust at the place where you'd like to build the station. And in Russia, the support of nuclear, according to the latest researches and the latest studies, and it's increasing. And initially, it was very popular at the place you have power stations, because it's very simple. It creates
employment.
Employment. You're absolutely right. But then people becoming very proud of that energy, of that technology which was developed within their country, and the final result. Now we have one of the highest rating of the employers for young generation. So we have a lot of young people who would like to work in Rosatom, and that's for us. That's the biggest result we managed to achieve, because it will be created not by us. I'm not talking about you and myself, but even the next generation. But we need young people just to transform the knowledge we currently have to the knowledge they will use in their future work.
One thing you said that was interesting there, I mean, here in the UK, we have a lot of issues with, the fact that public don't like nuclear. Yeah. They accept it. Same thing. In Hinkley, where we're building this plant, the local economy, it wants the plant. People like the fact that it gives jobs, but there's a general feeling they don't want it. Our impression, and it could be completely wrong, is that in Russia, if the government decides they're building a plant here, the people have to accept it. But you're saying that's not the case. The people can say, no, we don't want it here. It's the same sort of due process of planning and regulation that we have in the UK.
I guess, people always should have a chance, to say no if they don't want something. Like in Switzerland, I respect a lot. That's a country with a very good tradition and culture in the nuclear energy. But if the population decided after the referendum to say no to nuclear, it's their decision, and we have to respect that, and we have to execute that, as simple as that. That's why, we have to communicate to the public. And as you mentioned, after the Soviet changes, nuclear wasn't extremely popular, I would say. And we decided to start communication and explain people what are the benefits in terms of economy, in terms of energy, in terms of technologies, in terms of everything. And after several years, we saw some results. And I guess it has to be open discussion with the population, with the people who live there. And if they are against, not necessarily, even not necessarily, it has not to be implemented in that case. So public acceptance, that's the key to the successful project. And can you imagine, we decided to build a plant. Public is not agree. You build the plant, public is waiting for that. Finally, plant is built, and then they starting, to block it. The worst case scenario, you have a plant which is not working.
And a lot of investment that's not worked.
Yeah. So public is the key.
Let's talk about clean Okay, the big issue about, there are two issues, safety, and we can talk about new reactor technology, and I know there's stuff there, but let's talk about the cleanliness of nuclear. The positive of nuclear is it's low carbon, and everyone accepts that globally. The negative implication is that the fuel is dangerous, the cleansing operation, the decommissioning costs so much, which is why, for example, Hinkley has such a high strike price. You're here in Madrid, you're going to have you're helping with a National Geographic exhibition and event. Why are you guys involved? What is your message about how nuclear can actually be beneficial and not harmful for the environment?
Beneficial, as you told already, the main factor is decarbonization. And the project with National Geographic is aiming to explain that decarbonization is important not only for human beings, but for the whole planet and for the animals, for trees, for everything. So for water. So it's a complex subject which we have to address, and we have to solve that. And I guess nuclear, one of the solutions, but only having nuclear, it will not be solved. We have to unite our forces in order with alternative energies, with other forces, in order to achieve these goals. It's not that easy, and that's the benefit of nuclear, as I told you, decarbonization. Then you mentioned some things, like it's very important, to understand what you're saying, because you represent the kind of public,
Yeah, the cleanliness. How do you make sure that
there are
it's
some
not
general fears
Yes.
about nuclear. Mainly they related with the waste.
Yes.
Because, not necessarily some people, they don't know that fuel, what is the fuel, why the nuclear fuel is dangerous and so on. So for them, for common people, it's already, everything is related with the waste.
Yes.
So, and we have to address the issue of the waste, because if you are not clean, what it leads, decarbonization. So you produce just more waste. And for that, I think, the current attitude of the nuclear should be changed. And our vision is the future is the closing the cycle and the responsible lifetime fuel cycle management. So you have to look after the fuel from the very beginning, from the fresh fuel to the end, to the geological depository or reprocessing the fuel. That's why, we invest a lot as country, as the company, because our country also supports that.
Are you talking about recycling the fuel rods?
Recycling the fuel, and more of that. Recycling is not enough. You have to close the cycle in terms of using, other types of reactors, so-called, fast reactors, which allow to burn plutonium and to burn some high active waste and minor actinides. So that allowed to dramatically change the notion of cleanness of the nuclear energy. And it's also related to the issues such as non-proliferation and so on. So because it's not only clean or not clean, it's still dangerous, like fire. You have to look after that, and you have to think.
So what are you investing in? Are you going to take this waste and then are you going to just keep using it until it will eventually run out? How are you going to get rid of it then? Are you still talking about burial, or what's Rosatom's vision about this cleaner fuel cycle?
Yeah, because there are some studies, there are some schools, they say that you can use nuclear fuel, not to consider nuclear fuel not as a waste, but as a resource, as an asset, and recycle that in nuclear power plants after certain treatment, after reprocessing, and where you can exclude usage of some dangerous materials, and you recycle, useful materials such as uranium and plutonium to a certain extent. But in order to use that, you need new type of reactors, so-called Generation 4, which will allow you to use that kind of reprocessed materials to generate, on one hand, to generate electricity, but on the other hand, to change these materials from the bad materials to the good materials. So you need that kind of reactor. And Russia is the only country which managed to build 2 industrial reactors, so-called, fast reactors, in we call it Beloyarsk nuclear power plant. And you have 2 reactors, industrial reactors, BN600 and BN800. And we're starting to using MOX fuel in those reactors industrially. And I guess, that's the practical answer to the question whether we should close or to keep open the nuclear cycle.
What do you think this would do to a life cycle of a nuclear plant? Increase it from 50, 60 years to 100 years, 120 years, or is it a perpetual recycling?
Basically, first of all, you reduce waste, because currently what is happening, you use fuel cycle, you generate spent fuel, and what you do? You keep it near your station. You do nothing with that. You have a solution of interim storage, right? And that's a solution for the next generation. You can keep it for 50 years, but sooner or later you have to reprocess it, or you have to send it to the geological depository. But we see it as a resource, and which can improve the economics of the whole nuclear cycle. So it can roughly reduce the usage of uranium, something like 25%, and so it can improve the costs. But obviously, such complicated technology requires international cooperation and volumes. So that's why we starting investing, but we rely a lot on our partners in order to help us, to start that process industrial in order to make it more effective.
Let's talk about finally the international side of it. Obviously, there's we can't ignore the politics that's going on right now with America, Britain, the Russian whole thing. So putting that aside, that's a context for you as Rosatom, that there's an impression of what people are saying, don't invest in Russia, don't bring in sanctions, all of this is going on. How does that affect you when you're trying to, as you say, get more international cooperation to get cleaner fuel? And obviously the markets you can go to, they seem to be markets that in the West people would say would be, well, it's China, it's Iran, obviously places that Russia is with, but it's not kind of, in mainland Europe. How does the politics affect what you're trying to do as you say, a cleaner, more environmentally friendly business?
Our position is very simple. Obviously, you're absolutely right. You cannot avoid politics. It influences.
We don't like to avoid politics.
Yeah, we would like to, but we cannot avoid politics. But we have to do our own job. So we are not politicians, we are businessmen. So we're trying to do our business together with other partners. And just to illustrate my word, the first contract we signed with France Commissariat of Nuclear Energy in 1971, and it was in the middle of Cold War. And since that we keep working together, and France is one of the biggest partner for Russia in the nuclear industry, because we share, not because France and Russia, because we share the same vision on the nuclear fuel cycle and on the nuclear energy. And obviously, it's very difficult, to avoid, political turbulences and so on. But we just doing our business, and that's it. And we believe in that. And the best result when we have, even in difficult political times, we manage to do our business.
What about the view for where you're going to be right now? Am I right? You're in. Is it 35 countries Rosatom is in?
Depends, what you mean, by 35 countries.
I mean 35 countries where you're working with nations, building plants, or
I would say even more, because 35 countries, it's just in terms of nuclear plant buildings.
Yeah.
But in some other countries, we work very intensively together in the field of
sort of advisory or something.
Yeah,
like
it's we work in different areas, so supply of uranium material and so on, also medical isotopes. It's all around.
So what's your vision for Rosatom, and what in particular? I'd like to end with what your vision is, not just globally, but also in the UK, where we have obviously a big fuel crisis going on. And we have this big decarbonisation push, a government that's pushing it. and yet the public haven't really embraced nuclear as much. Those two final points, where do you think Rosatom will develop internationally, and what do you think about the nuclear picture in the UK?
I guess I'm very positive about the nuclear picture in the UK in general.
You're
I guess,
positive?
yeah, because I think it was a choice of British government as well of British people, to believe, to give a chance of nuclear and to make that decision about Hinkley Point, which is probably if you remember, last time at WNA in September, they announced that decision, and nuclear industry was wow, it was so positive because one of the most developed technological country decided to go forward with nuclear, and it was a huge positive sign for the whole nuclear industry. So I think all of us, all nuclear players, not only EDF or our China partners, but all around the globe have to contribute in order to make it happen. And we'd like to have a success, and we'd like to wish a lot of success to the nuclear program in the UK. And that in the UK we work together very intensively as well, and we supply some fuel, we supply some uranium product to the UK, and the cooperation is going on. And we believe the scientific forces will unite in order to solve all the difficulties we may have and we may face in the future. So I'm quite positive, regardless all the difficulties we have to overcome.
And finally, young people, the next generation, do you think that in 50 years' time, your grandkids, great-grandkids, they will accept nuclear as part of what their future is? Renewable energy, nuclear power, maybe, tidal. It'll just be a different world.
Obviously, even if you remove nuclear stations from the current picture, nuclear will stay, because you will keep the research reactors, you will keep production of isotopes. It's going to be still the nuclear units, and because it saves life, right? And people need it, and a lot of countries invest heavily in this field as well. But as well as a source of energy, I guess nuclear will stay, because for some countries which are not rich, as I told you, with the natural resources, it's a source of independence and very mature source of energy which can generate a lot of growth for emerging countries especially. But as well, nuclear, it's a complex subject. It requires a lot of science. And science, it's not, in one field, always, scientific researches lead to other areas. And I think we see nuclear as a kind of cradle of new technology developments. And it's not only energy company, but company oriented to the technological, sustainable development, oriented to the values. And I guess nuclear will be transformed, and it will become even more attractive for young people, my kids including.
Excellent. Have you invented nuclear fusion yet? That's my last one. You're working on it.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
It's one of those things that
nuclear project, it always was considered as a kind of international project, because it was so complicated. It's so huge scale.
That's the holy grail, isn't it? Can we do fusion?
We hopefully yes, and a lot of countries believe in that, because what the other reasons to invest in ITER project, which is currently has been executed in France. So we believe in that. But every day you can see it in the sky, sun. It's a fusion.
Well, we're here in Madrid, not in England. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.